Police officers, what happened when you searched an abandoned house? I noticed the house on Maple Street had Amazon packages piling up on the porch. This wasn't the nicest neighborhood, but not the worst either. The house belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Wright, a 78-year-old widow who lived alone. I'd spoken to her a few times during community meetings, and she seemed sharp and independent. But 3 days of untouched deliveries meant something was wrong. I pulled into her driveway and radioed dispatch about doing a welfare check. The house looked normal except for all the packages. Her car was in the driveway and the porch light was still on, even though it was mid-afternoon. I walked up and knocked firmly on the front door. "Mrs. Wright? This is Officer Davis with the police department. Just checking to make sure you're okay." No answer. I knocked again louder and rang the doorbell. Still nothing. I tried looking through the mail slot but couldn't see anything. The curtains were drawn on all the front windows, making it impossible to see inside. My gut told me this wasn't just someone on vacation. I walked around to the side of the house checking windows. Most had heavy curtains, but I found one in what looked like the living room with a small gap. I cupped my hands against the glass and peered inside. That's when I saw her. Mrs. Wright was lying on the floor near the couch, not moving. "Dispatch. I have an elderly female down inside the residence. I'm making entry." I ran back to the front door and tried the handle, but it was locked. I was about to radio for backup to help force entry when I remembered something. During a previous visit, Mrs. Wright had mentioned she kept her back door unlocked because the lock was broken and she was waiting for her son to fix it. I jogged around back, and sure enough, the door opened when I turned the handle. The kitchen smelled stale, like garbage that needed to be taken out. I called out while moving toward the living room where I'd seen her through the window. "Mrs. Wright? This is the police. I'm here to help." I found her lying on her side next to the coffee table. Her eyes were open and tracking me as I knelt beside her. She was conscious, but barely able to speak. Her lips were cracked, and her voice came out as a raspy whisper. "Can't. Get up." I immediately checked for injuries while calling for paramedics. No visible blood or obvious breaks, but she winced when I touched her hip. She was severely dehydrated with dry skin and sunken eyes. When I asked how long she'd been on the floor, she held up 2 fingers. "2 days? You've been here 2 days?" She nodded weakly. I grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen and helped her take small sips while we waited for the ambulance. She kept trying to tell me something, but her voice was too weak. I told her to save her energy and that help was coming. The paramedics arrived within minutes and started an IV while assessing her condition. They suspected a broken hip from the fall and severe dehydration. As they prepared to transport her, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "My son," she whispered urgently. "Do you want me to call your son? What's his number?" She shook her head violently and seemed agitated. The paramedics said we needed to move her soon, but she wouldn't let go of my wrist. Her eyes were wide with what looked like fear as she tried to speak again. "He did this." I leaned closer, thinking I'd misheard. "What did you say?" "My son." Pushed me. "On purpose." The paramedics exchanged concerned looks. Elder abuse was unfortunately common, but this was a serious accusation. I assured her we'd investigate and asked for her son's name and description. She said his name was Michael Wright, and he lived with her. "Where is Michael now?" I asked while pulling out my notepad. Her eyes went even wider, and she pointed behind me with a shaking finger. Her voice came out as barely a breath, but the words were clear. "Right behind you." I spun around fast, and my hand went straight to my weapon as I saw a big guy standing in the doorway to the kitchen. Michael Wright was taller than I expected, maybe 6 feet, and stocky with wide shoulders and thick arms. He wore dirty jeans with grease stains on the knees and a gray t-shirt that had seen better days. His face was red and twisted up with anger, mixed with panic, as his eyes jumped from his mother on the floor to me kneeling beside her. The paramedics behind me froze completely as they saw him too, and I could feel the whole room go tense. "Step back and show me your hands," I said, using my command voice while standing up slowly. Michael's eyes kept darting between his mother and me, and I could see him thinking hard about what to do next. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and his jaw worked like he was grinding his teeth. The paramedics stayed frozen behind me with the stretcher halfway ready, and I knew they were waiting to see what would happen. Michael took 1 step backward into the kitchen, and his whole body tensed up like a runner at the starting line. Then he bolted straight out the back door so fast it slammed against the wall with a bang that made everyone jump. I grabbed my radio immediately while moving toward the door to see which way he went. Suspect fled on foot heading north through the backyard. White male, 6 feet, jeans and gray shirt, requesting backup now. Through the back door, I could see him jumping over the chain-link fence into the neighbor's yard and disappearing behind their garage. I wanted to chase after him, but I couldn't leave Mrs. Wright and the paramedics alone without protection in case he circled back. The broken back door was still swinging open, and I pulled it closed while keeping my eyes on the backyard. I moved to the front window to check if he might come around that way, while radioing dispatch again with more details. His beat-up blue truck was still in the driveway with the keys probably in his pocket, so at least he couldn't drive away. Suspect vehicle is a blue Chevy pickup. License starts with 723, still in the driveway. I told dispatch while writing down the full plate number. The paramedics started moving again and carefully lifted Mrs. Wright onto the stretcher while I stayed by the window watching for any movement outside. She reached out with a shaky hand and grabbed my wrist weakly as they wheeled her past me toward the front door. "Thank you," she whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear it. Her eyes were wet with tears, but she looked relieved that Michael was gone and help had finally come. The paramedics loaded her into the ambulance smoothly while I stood guard on the porch, scanning the street in both directions. 2 patrol cars came screaming up the street with lights flashing and pulled up behind the ambulance just as they were closing the doors. The officers jumped out, and I pointed north toward where Michael had run while giving them a quick rundown of what happened. They split up immediately, with one heading north through the yards and the other circling around to cut him off from the east. I stayed at the house to preserve the scene and started taking photos with my phone of everything important. The coffee table had a dark stain on the corner that might be blood, and the carpet showed drag marks where Mrs. Wright had tried to pull herself. The broken back door lock was hanging loose with bent screws, like someone had forced it open before and never fixed it properly. I photographed the kitchen too, with dirty dishes piled up and empty beer cans on the counter showing Michael had been living here. About an hour later, a dark sedan pulled up, and Detective Serena Moss got out carrying a leather notebook and a camera. She was in her 40s with short brown hair and moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The crime scene techs arrived right behind her in their van and started unloading their equipment while she walked up to me. "Officer Davis, I'm Detective Moss from Elder Crimes Unit," she said while looking at the scene. "Walk me through everything from the beginning." I told her about the packages piling up and finding Mrs. Wright on the floor and what she said about Michael pushing her. The detective wrote everything down in her notebook and asked specific questions about timing and exact words that were said. The techs went through the house with their kits dusting for prints and taking samples while we talked on the porch. She had me show her exactly where I found Mrs. Wright and where Michael was standing when I saw him. Back at the station later, I sat at a computer typing up my report and trying to remember every single detail. My sergeant came by and read over my shoulder as I typed the part about Mrs. Wright's accusation against her son. "You did good going in when you did," he said, and patted my shoulder. Who knows how much longer she would have lasted. I finished the report and printed it out for the case file before heading out for the night, feeling drained from everything. The hospital was on my way home, so I stopped to check on Mrs. Wright, even though visiting hours were almost over. The nurses at the desk told me she was in room 218 and was stable but sedated after surgery on her hip. I found her sleeping with an IV in her arm and monitors beeping softly as they tracked her vital signs. Her color looked better already, and the nurse said she had a fractured hip, but should recover with proper care and physical therapy. The next morning, my phone rang early, and it was Hala Aguilar from Adult Protective Services asking about Mrs. Wright's case. She was already working on finding a safe place for Mrs. Wright to go after the hospital, since she couldn't go home with Michael still out there. "We need to protect her finances too," Hala said. "If he had access to her accounts, he might try to drain them while he's on the run." I hung up with Hala, and my phone rang again almost immediately with Detective Moss on the other end, telling me something interesting had come up. She'd been canvassing the neighborhood and found Nina Robles, who lived directly across from Mrs. Wright's house, and had heard a loud argument that morning. Nina was in her 60s and had been too scared to call police at the time, but wanted to help now that she knew what happened. Detective Moss asked if I could meet them at the station in an hour to hear what Nina had to say since I was the responding officer. I drove over and found them in interview room 3 with Nina looking nervous, but determined to do the right thing. She pulled out her phone and showed us that she'd actually made a recording that morning because she was thinking about filing a noise complaint. The audio was rough, but you could clearly hear Michael's voice yelling and then a distinct crash, followed by Mrs. Wright crying out in pain. Detective Moss had the tech department enhance the audio, and we could make out Michael shouting something about signing papers before the crash happened. Nina said she'd been hearing arguments for weeks, but this one was the worst, and she felt terrible for not calling someone sooner. While Detective Moss worked with the audio evidence, she also started digging into the financial side of things with the bank's cooperation. The records showed Michael had been making withdrawals from his mother's account for the past month, using her debit card at various ATMs around town. The amounts were always just under $500 to avoid triggering the bank's fraud alerts, but they added up to nearly $8,000 total. The bank provided time-stamped footage from the ATMs showing Michael's face clearly as he made each withdrawal while his mother had no idea. 2 days after the initial incident, I went back to the hospital to check on Mrs. Wright, who was much more alert after surgery and proper hydration. Detective Moss met me there, and we sat with Mrs. Wright as she gave a more complete statement about what had been happening. She told us Michael's gambling had gotten worse over the past year, and he'd become increasingly aggressive whenever she refused to give him money. He'd started by asking nicely, but then moved to guilt trips, and finally to grabbing her arms and shoving her when she said no. The morning she fell, he'd brought papers for her to sign that would add him to all her accounts, and she'd refused again. That's when he'd grabbed her shoulders and pushed her hard enough that she fell backward and hit her hip on the coffee table before landing on the floor. She'd begged him to help her up, but he just stood there looking down at her before walking out and leaving her there. I was typing up my supplemental report that afternoon when my work cell rang with an unknown number that turned out to be Michael. He must have gotten my number from his mother's phone before he ran, because he started talking fast about how this was all a misunderstanding. He claimed his mother was confused from the medication and that she'd fallen on her own while he was in another room. He kept saying I was overreacting to an old woman's imagination and that families have arguments all the time without it being abuse. His voice got more desperate as he talked, and he started suggesting that maybe his mother had dementia and didn't know what she was saying. I stayed professional and told him he needed to turn himself in and work through the legal system, but he hung up when I wouldn't agree that this was blown out of proportion. I immediately documented the entire call in detail and forwarded my notes to Detective Moss, who added it to the growing case file. His attempts to manipulate the story and blame his mother's mental state only made me more determined to see this through the right way. The case went to Assistant District Attorney Anthony Mercer the next day for review, and Detective Moss and I met with him in his office downtown. He was in his 50s with gray hair and looked at everything we'd gathered so far, including the audio, bank records, and medical reports. He said the financial crimes were solid, but proving intent for the assault charge would be harder without more evidence or witnesses to the actual push. He wanted us to keep building the case and suggested we get a protective order immediately to keep Michael away from his mother if he tried to contact her. Hala Aguilar took the lead on the protective order and worked with the court to get an emergency hearing that same afternoon. The judge reviewed the evidence, including the recording Nina had made and Mrs. Wright's statement about the pattern of abuse. He signed the order barring Michael from any contact with his mother or coming within 500 feet of her for the next year. The order also covered the hospital and any facility where she might be staying during her recovery, which meant Michael couldn't even try to visit. 2 officers went to serve the protective order at an address Detective Moss had gotten from Michael's friend where he'd been staying. They knocked on the door, and the friend answered looking nervous and said Michael was in the back bedroom. But Michael must have heard them or been watching, because he bolted out the back door as soon as they started down the hallway. The officers chased him through the backyard, but he jumped a fence and disappeared into the neighborhood, leaving his car behind at the friend's house. Detective Moss called me the next morning and asked if I could help search Michael's room at Mrs. Wright's house for more evidence. We got there with a search warrant and started going through his belongings while crime scene techs photographed everything. The room was a mess with dirty clothes everywhere and empty beer bottles on every surface, but we found what we were looking for in his dresser drawer. There were checkbooks and credit cards, all in Mrs. Wright's name, along with her social security card and other identity documents he'd obviously taken. Several checks were missing from the sequence in the checkbook, which meant he'd probably taken them to use later when he needed money. Detective Moss got a call from the bank's fraud department 2 days later while I was helping catalog the evidence we'd found. The bank manager had pulled ATM security footage after we'd flagged Mrs. Wright's accounts for suspicious activity. The footage showed Michael clear as day using his mother's debit card at 3 different ATM locations around town, all time-stamped during the 2 days she was lying on her floor, unable to move. We watched the footage together in the conference room, and you could see him looking around nervously at each machine before punching in the PIN and taking out the maximum daily limit. The timestamps matched perfectly with Mrs. Wright's medical records, showing when she'd fallen and when I'd found her. Detective Moss made copies of everything and added it to the growing pile of evidence, while I wondered how someone could leave their own mother helpless on the floor and then go steal her money. She pulled up the address history for Mrs. Wright's house next and found something that made both of us pay attention. There had been 4 calls to that address over the past 2 years, all coded as verbal disputes or domestic disturbances. Each time officers had responded, but Mrs. Wright had refused to press charges or make a statement, telling them it was just a family disagreement and everything was fine. The reports showed Michael had been present each time, but claimed he was just trying to help his mother, who was getting confused in her old age. This pattern was something Detective Moss had seen too many times in elder abuse cases, where victims protect their abusers out of fear or shame or misplaced loyalty. The hospital social worker called that afternoon with her assessment of Mrs. Wright's injuries and overall condition. She'd done a full evaluation and found clear signs of long-term caregiver stress, along with bruising patterns on Mrs. Wright's upper arms that looked like grip marks from being grabbed hard. The bruises were older than the fall, which meant this wasn't the first time Michael had gotten physical with her. The social worker also noted defensive wounds on Mrs. Wright's hands, suggesting she'd tried to protect herself when she was pushed. All of this medical evidence backed up her story that Michael had deliberately pushed her down, rather than it being an accident. Detective Moss's phone rang while we were reviewing the medical reports, and she put it on speaker when she saw it was an unknown number. The man on the other end said his name was Tony, and he knew Michael from the casino where they both played poker regularly. He'd heard about the investigation from other players and wanted to share some text messages Michael had sent him the week before his mother fell. Detective Moss recorded the call as Tony read the messages, where Michael was desperately asking to borrow money, saying things about how his mom was being stubborn, but he'd get it figured out soon. In one message, Michael wrote that his mother didn't understand he needed the money for important things, and that she'd come around eventually. Tony said Michael owed money to some dangerous people and had been getting more desperate over the past month. We spent the next 2 days having officers check all the bars and gambling spots where Michael was known to hang out. They showed his photo around and asked if anyone had seen him recently or knew where he might be staying. Several people admitted seeing him in the past few days, but claimed they didn't know where he was sleeping now that he couldn't go home. One bartender mentioned Michael had been drinking heavily and talking about how his mother had ruined his life by calling the cops. The bartender said Michael seemed angry and kept saying this was all a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion. Mrs. Wright called me from the hospital that evening and said she'd remembered something important. 2 days before Michael pushed her, he'd left her a voicemail on her cell phone that she'd saved because it scared her. She played it for me over the phone, and I could hear Michael's voice starting calm, but getting louder and more aggressive as the message went on. He demanded she add him to all her bank accounts and said she was being selfish keeping money from her own son. By the end of the 2-minute message, he was practically yelling that she'd regret not helping him when he needed it most. I recorded the message on my work phone and immediately sent it to Detective Moss, who added it to the evidence file. A forensic nurse specializing in elder abuse cases came to examine the photos we'd taken of Mrs. Wright's injuries. She studied each image carefully and provided her expert opinion that the grip marks on Mrs. Wright's arms showed a specific pattern, indicating someone had held her forcefully while she tried to pull away. The angle and placement of the bruises suggested Mrs. Wright had been facing her attacker and trying to resist when she was grabbed and pushed. The nurse's report directly contradicted any story about an accidental fall or Mrs. Wright simply losing her balance on her own. Sitting in my patrol car between calls the next day, I had to stop and check myself about this case. Part of me wanted to find Michael myself and make him pay for what he'd done to his mother, but I knew that wasn't how the system worked. I had to follow procedure and let the investigation run its course, even though every instinct told me to do more. Professional distance was hard to maintain when you saw an elderly woman hurt by the one person who should have protected her above all others. That afternoon, Detective Moss and I met with ADA Mercer again to review all the new evidence we'd gathered. He looked through everything carefully, but explained that we still needed to prove Michael's specific intent to harm his mother, not just that he'd been reckless or negligent. The voicemail and Nina's audio recording helped establish a clear pattern of escalation from financial demands to threats to actual violence. He wanted us to keep building the case, but felt we were getting close to having enough for serious charges. Nina Robles called Detective Moss later that day, saying she'd been going through her home security system and found something we needed to see. Her camera faced the street and had a partial view of Mrs. Wright's porch. The footage was grainy and dark, but showed someone matching Michael's build walking up to his mother's porch at 2 in the morning, the night after she'd fallen. The figure could be seen taking several packages before walking back toward the street. This was a direct violation of the protective order we'd gotten and showed Michael knew his mother was hurt, but still came to steal from her. Hala Aguilar worked fast to get Mrs. Wright moved to a nursing facility 2 days later, where she could recover safely. She picked a place across town that specialized in rehab for hip injuries and made sure all the intake forms had big red warnings about the protective order against Michael. The staff got briefed about not giving out any information if someone called asking about Mrs. Wright, and security had Michael's photo at the front desk. I helped move some of Mrs. Wright's personal items from her house to make her room feel more comfortable, grabbing photo albums and her favorite blanket, while crime scene tape still blocked off parts of the living room. Detective Moss spent that whole week putting together the arrest warrant paperwork, laying out every piece of evidence we'd collected in careful order for the judge to review. She included my initial report, the neighbor's audio recording, the ATM footage showing Michael using his mother's cards after she fell, the voicemail threats, and the security video of him stealing packages while violating the protective order. The judge signed both arrest and search warrants the next morning after reading through the thick file Detective Moss had built. We had 4 charges ready, including elder abuse, assault causing injury, financial crimes, and violating a protective order. Detective Moss got a tip that Michael was staying at the Budget Inn near the interstate, so 3 units rolled up there that afternoon to make the arrest. The desk clerk said Michael had been in room 12 for 3 nights, but when we knocked and announced ourselves, no answer came. The manager opened the door for us, and we found the room empty, except for some fast food wrappers and dirty clothes on the bed. The clerk said he'd seen Michael leave about 20 minutes earlier after getting a phone call, loading a duffel bag into a beat-up sedan, and driving off fast. Someone had warned him we were coming. The next evening, an officer on patrol spotted Michael outside a convenience store on the south side of town buying cigarettes. Michael saw the patrol car pulling up and took off running before the officer even got out. He sprinted through the parking lot and into an alley between 2 apartment buildings, while the officer radioed for backup and gave chase on foot. Michael was younger and knew the neighborhood better, cutting through yards and jumping fences while the officer tried to keep up. They ran for 3 blocks before Michael scaled a 6-foot chain-link fence into someone's backyard and disappeared between houses. More units arrived and we searched the area for an hour, but he'd vanished into the residential neighborhood. 2 days went by with no sightings until the bank's fraud department called Detective Moss about suspicious activity on Mrs. Wright's account. Their system flagged Michael trying to withdraw $300 from an ATM on Riverside Drive, but the transaction got declined because we'd frozen the accounts. Detective Moss figured Michael was desperate for cash and would probably try another ATM in the same area since he'd been making small withdrawals to avoid attention. She set up surveillance on 3 ATMs within a mile of where he'd tried the first one. I took a shift watching the one outside a grocery store while 2 other officers covered machines at a gas station and strip mall nearby. We sat there all night drinking coffee and watching every person who walked up to those machines, but Michael never showed. Detective Moss said he must have seen the declined message and realized we'd frozen the accounts, so he'd gotten spooked and changed tactics. She shifted focus to tracking down his known associates and gambling buddies to see if anyone was hiding him or knew where he might go next. 4 more days passed with officers checking all his usual spots and talking to people who knew him, but everyone claimed they hadn't seen him recently. Then the hospital called to say someone had left a voicemail on Mrs. Wright's room phone, even though she'd been moved days ago. The message was Michael rambling for almost 3 minutes, switching between apologizing and blaming his mother for ruining his life. Near the end, he mentioned needing to stay low at the place near the highway until things cooled down. Detective Moss pulled up a map and found 2 motels along the highway that matched his description, both cheap places that took cash and didn't ask questions. She planned a coordinated approach using 6 officers to hit both motels at the same time so he couldn't slip away again if someone tipped him off. We'd cover all exits including windows and back doors before announcing ourselves. The first motel came up empty, but at the second one, the Traveler's Rest, the manager confirmed someone matching Michael's description had checked in 2 nights ago paying cash. Room 23 at the back of the building. We moved into position quietly with officers covering the bathroom window, the front door, and both ends of the building so he had nowhere to run. Detective Moss knocked and announced we had a warrant for his arrest. For a minute nothing happened, and I thought he might have slipped out again, but then the door opened slowly, and Michael stood there looking exhausted with dark circles under his eyes and 3 days of stubble. He saw all the officers surrounding him and just put his hands up without saying anything, letting us cuff him without any resistance. Back at the station, Detective Moss interviewed him for 2 hours, while I watched from behind the one-way glass. Michael kept changing his story, first saying his mother fell on her own, then claiming it was an accident during an argument, then finally admitting he'd grabbed her, but insisting he never meant for her to fall and hit the table. He couldn't explain the ATM footage, or why he'd been stealing from her accounts for months before the assault happened. When Detective Moss showed him the bank records documenting $8,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, he just stared at the papers and said the gambling debts had gotten out of control, and he'd planned to pay it all back. The next morning, Detective Moss called to say the DA's office was moving fast on the charges after reviewing all our evidence. Anthony Mercer from the prosecutor's office filed 4 separate counts against Michael, including elder abuse, assault causing bodily injury to someone over 65, financial elder abuse for the stolen money, and violating the protective order when he went back for those packages. The assault charge alone could get him 2 to 4 years in state prison if convicted, and the financial abuse added another possible 3 years. 2 days later, I sat in the back of the courtroom for Michael's bail hearing and watched his court-appointed attorney argue that he wasn't a flight risk since he'd turned himself in peacefully at the motel. The prosecutor pointed out he'd already run twice and only gave up when surrounded by 6 officers with nowhere to go. The judge set bail at $75,000 with strict conditions, including an ankle monitor if he made bail, mandatory enrollment in a gambling addiction program, and absolutely no contact with his mother or going within 500 feet of her location. Michael stayed in county jail since nobody would post that kind of money for him. I drove out to see Mrs. Wright at the nursing facility where she was doing physical therapy 3 times a day to rebuild strength in her hip. The place smelled like disinfectant and old food, but her room had flowers from neighbors and cards taped to the wall. She was using a walker to move down the hallway when I arrived, taking slow, careful steps while a therapist stayed close. We sat in the common area, and she told me she felt torn up inside about everything, angry at Michael for hurting her, but sad about what he'd become because of his gambling problem. She said he wasn't always like this, that he used to be a good son before the addiction took over, and part of her still loved him even after what he did. 3 weeks after the arrest, we all had to testify at the preliminary hearing, where the judge would decide if there was enough evidence for a full trial. I took the stand first and walked through finding Mrs. Wright on the floor, her accusation about Michael pushing her and him appearing behind me in the doorway before running. Detective Moss testified about the financial records showing $8,000 in stolen money, the ATM footage of Michael using her cards while she was hurt, and his changing story during the interview. Nina Robles came next with her phone recording that the court's audio tech had cleaned up, so you could clearly hear Michael yelling at his mother to sign something, then a crash, and Mrs. Wright crying out in pain. The defense attorney tried to argue it was just a family argument that got out of hand, but the judge found probable cause on all charges and set a trial date for 2 months out. The audio recording became even more important when the tech enhancement revealed Michael saying something about breaking her hip if she didn't cooperate, which happened about 30 seconds before the crash sound. The whole neighborhood had rallied around Mrs. Wright, with people visiting her at the facility and offering to testify about things they'd seen or heard over the months. A week before the trial date, Michael's attorney approached Ada Mercer about working out a plea agreement, since the evidence was so strong and a jury would probably convict on everything. The deal they proposed had Michael pleading guilty to felony elder abuse in exchange for dropping the other charges, with conditions including mandatory treatment, paying back all the stolen money, and permanent restraining orders to protect his mother. Mercer brought the offer to Mrs. Wright through Hala Aguilar, since victims get input on plea deals in elder abuse cases. Mrs. Wright spent 2 days thinking it over and talking with Hala about what she really wanted from all this. She finally said she wanted Michael to get real help for his gambling problem, but also needed to know she'd be safe from him. So she'd agree to the plea if it included at least 6 months of inpatient addiction treatment, and he had to pay back every penny he stole, even if it took years. The final plea agreement had Michael getting 3 years of supervised probation, with the first 9 months in a residential gambling treatment facility, followed by mandatory outpatient counseling and regular drug testing, since gambling addicts often have substance issues too. He also had to pay restitution of $8,200 at a minimum of $200 a month once he got a job, plus a permanent restraining order keeping him away from his mother for the rest of her life. The judge accepted the plea, but warned Michael that any violation of probation terms would mean immediate prison time with no second chances. While all the legal stuff was happening, Adult Protective Services worked with Mrs. Wright to set up a limited conservatorship for her finances, so nobody could take advantage of her again. A professional fiduciary would handle her bank accounts and bills, while she kept control over her daily spending money and personal decisions, which gave her protection without taking away all her independence. The conservatorship paperwork took about a month to process through the court, but once it was approved, the fiduciary found even more problems with Michael's theft, including credit cards he'd opened in her name that she didn't know about. Detective Moss came by the station to tell me she was officially closing the investigation file since Michael had pled guilty and started his treatment program. She said this actually had one of the better outcomes she'd seen in elder abuse cases, because Mrs. Wright survived, got proper care, and the abuser was being held accountable with mandatory treatment instead of just prison time that wouldn't fix the underlying problem. The next week, I stopped by the nursing facility to see Mrs. Wright one more time before she got discharged. She was sitting up in bed doing physical therapy exercises with a resistance band when I knocked on her doorframe. Her face lit up when she saw me, and she waved me in, grabbing my hand with both of hers. "Thank you for saving my life," she said quietly. I told her I was just doing my job, but she shook her head and squeezed my hands harder. We both knew department rules meant I couldn't stay involved once the case was done, but she said knowing people cared made all the difference in her recovery. 2 days later, the neighborhood association called an emergency meeting at the community center about what happened to Mrs. Wright. About 40 people showed up, mostly older folks who lived alone or had elderly parents in the area. The association president talked about warning signs of elder abuse like unexplained injuries, sudden money problems, and isolation from friends and family. Several neighbors volunteered to set up a buddy system where they'd check on elderly residents every few days, bringing in mail or just knocking to make sure they were okay. Nina Robles stood up and said she felt guilty for not calling police sooner when she heard the arguing, but everyone told her she did the right thing by recording it and coming forward later. 6 weeks after that terrible welfare check, Mrs. Wright finally got to go home. I drove by her house that morning and saw a medical transport van in the driveway with workers helping her up the porch steps using a walker. A home health aide in scrubs was already there setting up grab bars and organizing her medications on the kitchen counter. Her hip had healed well according to the discharge papers Hala Aguilar shared with the department, and she'd gained back 12 pounds with proper meals and hydration at the facility. New locks were installed on all the doors, motion sensor lights covered the yard, and a medical alert button hung around her neck. Meanwhile, Michael had started his 9-month treatment program at a residential facility 2 hours away. His attorney sent a letter to Mrs. Wright's attorney saying Michael wanted to apologize for everything he'd done and asking if she'd read a letter from him. The letter came a week later, but Mrs. Wright told Hala she wasn't ready to look at it yet. Maybe someday, but not now. She put it in a drawer unopened, saying she needed more time to heal before thinking about forgiveness. My sergeant called me into his office the following Monday and handed me a department commendation certificate for the welfare check and investigation support. It wasn't a big ceremony or anything, just a piece of paper for my file and a handshake. I thanked him, but honestly, I was just doing what any officer should do when they find someone in trouble. The case changed how I looked at my job, though, especially when it came to checking on elderly folks living alone. 3 months after that first welfare check, I was on regular patrol and turned down Maple Street out of habit. Mrs. Wright's house looked completely different with fresh paint on the trim and new flowers in window boxes. She was out front watering her garden with her aide standing nearby holding her walker. The Amazon packages were gone, the porch light worked right, and the yard was neat and trimmed. When she saw my patrol car slow down, she smiled big and waved, and I waved back before continuing my route. The aide helped her back to the porch swing where she could rest in the shade. The system had worked this time, not perfect, but good enough to protect someone who needed help and make sure the person who hurt her got treatment instead of just sitting in jail. Michael was getting help for his gambling problem in that treatment center. Mrs. Wright had support to stay safe in her own home, and the whole neighborhood was watching out for each other better than before. Every welfare check I do now feels different because I know what might be hiding behind those quiet doors with the piling newspapers. Sometimes it's nothing, just someone on vacation who forgot to stop deliveries, but sometimes it's another Mrs. Wright who needs help and can't get it on their own. She's safe now with her aide checking on her every day. Michael's getting the help he should have gotten years ago, and that's really the best outcome we can hope for in cases like this. That's all I've got. You've already wasted this much time, so why not subscribe and make it official?